youngest son cry. We are talking about a vicious, calculated attack on a 7-year-old boy, so brutal that staff who witnessed it called the words shockingly cruel. And when William found out, he did something nobody in that family has ever dared to do before him. The sound that broke the Highlands. Lewis's scream tore through Balmoral Castle and froze everyone who heard it. This was not a scraped knee or a small tantrum. This was a 7-year-old boy music completely shattered by words that were never meant for a child to hear. It started as an ordinary afternoon after a formal family lunch. The adults drifted away to talk among themselves, leaving the children to run around the grounds unsupervised. Nobody thought twice about it. Why would they? These were family gatherings, the kind that had happened 100 times before without incident. The estate itself sits deep inside the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by hills and open fields, the kind of quiet, private setting the family always used to escape the cameras and the noise of the outside world. It was supposed to be safe there. It was supposed to be the one place these children could just be children without anyone watching or judging them. The estate had been in the family for generations. Music, and every summer, the same routine played out. The older relatives would gather in the drawing room after lunch, trading updates about their lives, while the younger ones wandered off toward the gardens or the stables. Nannies usually kept a loose eye on things. But on this particular afternoon, most of them had been pulled aside to help prepare for an evening reception, leaving a gap in supervision that normally would have meant nothing at all. Royal children had run free on these grounds for decades without a single serious incident. That is exactly why nobody could have predicted what was coming. The children that day included Prince George and Princess Charlotte, too. Both older than Lizzie, and both off exploring a different part of the grounds when it happened, which meant Lewis was completely alone when Camilla's granddaughter, Lola Parker B.S., approached Musicum. Lola looked at Lewis with a coldness that had nothing playful in it, and what she said next would haunt this family for years to come. She spat out that he was a crybaby, just like his mother and just like his grandmother before her. And that was just the beginning. Lola said the women in his family had turned tears into a weapon, that they knew exactly how to fake pain and squeeze sympathy out of anyone watching. Like that wasn't already cruel enough for her liking. Lola then bluntly told Louis that nobody ever really wanted him in the first place, that he was just a spare child like his miserable uncle. To make matters even worse, Lola said all these with the flat certainty of someone reciting a fact everyone already agreed on, not the wild guess of a child making up an insult on the spot. And that right there should stop you cold. Because where does a young girl learn to attack 2 generations of women in a single sentence? Where does she pick up language that precise, music that calculated, that clearly built to wound? Children do not invent cruelty like that out of thin air. They copy it. Somewhere behind closed doors, adults had been tearing into Princesses Catherine and Diana, and Lola had been standing close enough to catch every single word. This was not one careless comment overheard by accident. This was a worldview passed down and practiced until it became second nature. Louis did not understand the history buried inside Lola's words. He was too young to know who Diana really was or why her name carried so much weight. But he understood the venom behind the attack, and that alone was enough to break him completely. So Louis ran to his mother, sobbing, with his whole body shaking so hard he could barely breathe. And for a moment, the entire estate went dead silent, except for the sound of a child falling apart. But here is the twist nobody saw coming. It wasn't Louise's tears that froze the staff in place. It was Catherine's face. She did not scream. She did not storm across the lawn demanding answers. Instead, her expression turned cold and locked. One witness, even later, said what scared them most was not that Catherine felt nothing. It was obvious she felt everything, and she was holding it back with an iron grip that could snap at any second. Because Lola's words had not just wounded Lousy, they had reached straight through time and struck Diana, too. A woman no longer here to defend her own name. Staff later admitted this was not even the first time something like this had happened. Smaller jabs from Camilla's side of the family had slipped through before, brushed off quietly so nobody had to make a scene. Some staff even recalled a specific gathering months earlier where a similar remark had slipped out during a formal dinner, then quickly smoothed over with laughter before anyone could dwell on it. Nobody wanted to be the person who made things awkward at a family event. So, the comment passed without consequence, filed away as nothing more than an unfortunate joke. A comment here about how the Wales children were being raised too soft. A sly remark there about Catherine seeking attention with her charity work. Each one was small enough to ignore on its own, but they were stacking up quietly in the background like a debt nobody was paying attention to. One former staff member later described it as watching a slow drip erode stone. Music. And that is exactly how this kind of poison survives inside a family like this one. It does not announce itself. Music, it hides behind polite smiles and dinner table small talk until it finally breaks through in a moment nobody can pretend not to notice. But this time the cruelty was too loud, too calculated, and far too public to bury. And if you know Diana's story, then you already know exactly why this cut so deep. She spent years insisting her pain was real, only to be mocked by people inside this very family who called her too emotional and too dramatic. Now here it was again, decades later, aimed straight at a 7-year-old boy who had no idea what he was even being accused of. History was not repeating itself quietly. It was slamming into the next generation full force. Other guests at the estate that day later admitted they had frozen, too, unsure whether to step in or stay back, caught between the instinct music to comfort a sobbing child and the unspoken rule that family disputes were not something outsiders touched. A few of the younger cousins who witnessed the whole thing went unusually quiet for the rest of the afternoon, sensing that something bigger than a simple squabble had just taken place in front of them. Even if they could not fully explain what it was, Catherine said nothing. She just scooped up her son, held him close, and walked away without a single word to anyone watching. But something inside her had already caught fire, music, and it was not going out until she found her husband and told him exactly what had happened. The conversation behind closed doors. That night, Catherine walked into the room where William was waiting, and what came next was not a quiet music talk between two tired parents. This was a reckoning that had been building for years, and it finally exploded into the open. Catherine had waited until the children were settled and the house had gone quiet before she brought it up. Not because she needed time to calm down, but because she wanted every word she said to land with full music weight, without interruption, and without anyone else in the room to soften the blow. But Catherine did not lead with Louis. She led with Diana. "You know exactly what they did to your mother," she told William with her voice steady and unflinching. "They isolated her. They mocked her pain until she had nobody left to turn to. Music. And today they did it again to your son." William sat frozen as Catherine laid out the truth with a directness that gave him nowhere to hide. This family had failed Diana, not just through the media circus that hounded her every move, but through something far crueler. They had shut her out from the inside, made her feel like an outsider in her own home, and left her to carry that pain completely alone. Catherine reminded William, too, of the quieter details, music, the ones rarely spoken about openly. How Diana had once tried to raise concerns about her treatment within the family and been told in so many words that she was imagining things or exaggerating for attention. How the people meant to guide and protect her instead treated her instincts as a problem to be managed rather than a warning worth taking seriously. Catherine was not simply recounting history for the sake of it. She was building a case methodically, the way someone lays out evidence when they already know the verdict they want. Then Catherine said the words that changed everything. She looked her husband dead in the eye and told him she would not let history repeat itself. Not with George, not with Charlotte, and absolutely not with Louis. Now here is what makes this moment hit so hard. William had buried something as a boy, a memory of overhearing something vicious said about his own mother by someone inside the family circle. He never told a soul, not even Catherine, until that very night when her words ripped the memory straight back into the light. William had spent decades convincing himself that memory did not matter anymore, that it was just a childhood scar he had long since outgrown. But some wounds do not heal quietly. They just wait for the right moment to reopen. So he admitted to Catherine in a voice barely above a whisper that he had spent years telling himself it did not matter that children misheard things all the time, that surely he had exaggerated the cruelty of what he overheard as a boy. But sitting there that night watching his own son's tear-streaked face replay in his mind, William understood for the first time that he had not exaggerated anything at all. He had simply been too afraid to believe it. William's hands stayed still on the table in front of him the entire time Catherine spoke, though his jaw tightened more than once. And that was the only outward sign of what was happening underneath his composed exterior. He had built a career out of appearing measured in public. But that night, in private, the mask came dangerously music, close to slipping entirely, and Catherine was not finished yet. She reminded William of a promise he made to himself as a grieving teenager. A silent vow that if he ever held real power, he would use it to stop this kind of cruelty from touching anyone he loved again. This was not just Catherine asking her husband to protect their son. This was her calling in a debt he owed to the boy he used to be. So when Kensington Palace woke up different the next morning, it was not sudden at all. It had been building for years, just waiting for a spark, and staff noticed the shift immediately. Nobody looked afraid exactly, but a sharp, focused energy moved through the halls that had never been there before. Senior aides were pulled into closed-door meetings without warning, and certain corridors were suddenly off-limits. Even long-time employees who had weathered every royal scandal for decades said they had never felt anything quite like the mood inside those walls that morning. Inside the palace started calling it the Eraser Mandate, and the coldness of that name alone sent a chill through everyone who heard it. The directive itself ran several pages long, covering every possible avenue where Camilla's extended family had built visibility over the years. Nothing was left to interpretation. Even minor charity associations that carried the family name in small print music were flagged for review. Officials tasked with implementing it later said the level of detail suggested this had been thought through carefully long before the Windsor incident ever happened. As though William had already mapped out exactly what he would do the moment the right trigger arrived. What terrified people most was not the size of the punishment. Families fight and punishments happen all the time. What terrified them was how William delivered it. He never raised his voice once. There was no shouting and no dramatic scene for anyone to point to later. Just calm, ice-cold instructions handed down with total control. And somehow that made it feel far more permanent than any explosion of rage ever could. Staff who had worked inside these palace walls for decades said they almost preferred the shouting matches of old scandals, because at least those eventually cooled down. This felt like something that had been engineered to never thaw. There was no room for negotiation built into the plan either, no clause allowing for a future reconciliation, and no path back for anyone affected once the directive took effect. Word spread quickly among the wider family that this was not a punishment with an expiration date. Music, it was a permanent redrawing of who belonged inside the institution and who did not, and everyone touched by it understood there would be no appeal process worth attempting. Then came the twist that made the whole thing even darker. Buried inside that list of music strip titles was a role Diana herself had fought hard to open up decades earlier back, when she pushed this family to modernize and let more people in. Diana had spent years arguing that the institution needed to feel less like a closed fortress music and more like something the public could actually connect with, and that particular role had been one of her small hard-won victories. So, in trying to protect his own children from repeating his mother's pain, William ended up tearing down one of the last pieces of his mother's own legacy. Talk about a bitter, twisted irony that nobody inside that palace could ignore. Some of the older staff, who remember Diana's original push for that role, said it felt almost cruel in a way nobody had intended. She had fought so hard to make the family feel less closed off, and now her own son was closing it right back up again. Though for reasons she likely would have understood better than anyone. Protecting a child from cruelty was exactly the kind of fight Diana used to wage herself, even if the method looked nothing like what she once envisioned. Meanwhile, Charles had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. Nobody consulted him. Nobody warned him. He found out only after the directive was already law. And he found out through a letter from William. The letter used every proper title and honorific required when addressing a father and king. It was polished and respectful on the surface, but underneath all that formality sat one brutal message. Music, there was nothing left to discuss. When Camilla found out, she exploded. "You cannot let him do this," she reportedly screamed to Charles. "He is challenging your throne before you have even left it." She demanded he override his son immediately. She even threatened to run straight to the press with her own version of events, ready to paint herself as an innocent grandmother under attack. Camilla reportedly spent days trying to reach William directly, only to be told repeatedly that his schedule did not allow for a meeting. Whether that was true or simply a convenient excuse, music, the message it sent was unmistakable. William had nothing further to discuss with her, and he intended to make that clear through his continued silence. Charles did absolutely nothing, and people close to him say his silence was not just exhaustion from years of family chaos. Some believe it was guilt eating him alive, like a quiet admission that he never protected Diana from this exact same cruelty decades earlier. And now he could not bring himself to stop his son from finally doing what he never had the courage to do. Those closest to Charles say he sat alone in his study for hours after that letter arrived, wrestling with a version of himself he had spent 30 years trying to forget. Charles reportedly read that letter twice before setting it down, and then a third time later that same evening, as though searching each sentence for some opening that would let him respond differently music than the situation seemed to demand. Aides who worked closely with Charles during that period described him as unusually quiet in the days that followed. Music, distracted during meetings that had nothing to do with the situation and prone to long pauses before answering even simple questions. Nobody dared ask him directly what was going through his mind. Music, they simply watched a king they had known for years carry something heavy that he clearly had no intention of sharing with anyone. As for Lola, her punishment looked nothing like a dramatic exile, and that made it colder than anything else. She simply vanished. There was no farewell, no statement, and no explanation given to anyone. Every future guest list quietly dropped her name, and within weeks, her social media accounts were dragged offline one after another until nothing remained. Scrubbed clean without a single word. There was no scandal anyone could point a finger at. Just a girl who used to smile in family photographs, disappearing from the institution's world as if she had never existed at all.